They say war is fought with bullets, steel, and discipline. But what happens when soldiers find themselves face to face with something their training never prepared them for, something they cannot fight, something they cannot even understand? Tonight we're stepping into a story whispered among veterans, the kind of story that never makes it into the official reports. Because some experiences are simply too strange, too terrifying, too unbelievable to be written down. Fort Hood, Texas, 1992. The storm rolled across the base like a living beast, lightning slicing through the darkness, thunder rattling the very walls of the barracks. 2 young soldiers had drawn the midnight shift, stationed out by the old chain-link perimeter fence. For them, it should have been another uneventful night, long hours of silence, broken only by the hum of the floodlights and the patter of rain. But silence can play tricks, and fear has a way of seeping in when you least expect it. The men leaned on their rifles, trying to stay awake, trading jokes under their breath, pretending they weren't spooked by the storm. But then one of them froze. Out beyond the fence, just at the edge of the light, something moved. At first it was only a shadow, a blur, a distortion in the rain. But the longer they stared, the clearer it became that this was no trick of the storm. The figure crawled, not walked, crawled, low to the ground, its movements jerky, unnatural. Every few steps it would pause, twisting its head backward. The human spine isn't built for that, and yet that's exactly what it did. One soldier whispered, "Do you see that?" The other gripped his weapon tighter. His voice cracked. "It's nothing. Just the storm. Just the storm." But deep down, both of them knew. This wasn't the storm. Then another shape appeared behind the fence, and then another, dozens of faint silhouettes just out of reach of the floodlights, gathering, waiting, watching. Their faces weren't clear, but the soldiers felt the weight of their eyes. The air grew heavy. The rain seemed to fall quieter, the storm itself retreating, as if nature didn't want to disturb whatever was happening at that fence line. The younger of the 2 soldiers raised his rifle, but his finger trembled on the trigger. His partner shook his head violently. Don't you dare! If you fire, we're dead." Imagine the terror-trained warriors, armed to the teeth, paralyzed not because of what they saw, but because of what they couldn't explain. The crawling figure reached the fence, gripping the metal with hands that looked more like claws. Its face turned fully now, jaw unhinged, eyes glowing faintly with something inhuman. The soldiers stumbled backward, breath caught in their throats, and then just like that, it was gone. The fence rattled, the floodlights flickered, and the figures in the darkness melted into the storm. The 2 men stood there, drenched in rain and sweat, too stunned to speak. Hours later, when their shift ended, they didn't write it in the logbook. They didn't tell the commander. They didn't even tell their brothers in arms, because who would believe them? But years later, over drinks at reunions in hushed tones, they would admit that night never left them. The sound of the fence rattling, the feeling of being watched, the sight of that crawling thing in the rain. Some nightmares don't fade. They linger, growing sharper with time. And this one was real. The storm at Fort Hood was only the beginning. What those 2 young soldiers witnessed that night, shadows crawling beyond the fence, figures gathering in silence, would leave a mark that no amount of military discipline could erase. But to understand why their fear ran so deep, we have to step back. Step into the silence of the barracks, the endless nights of waiting, and the subtle signs that something was wrong long before the first silhouette appeared. Because terror doesn't always arrive with a scream. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, patiently, like water through cracks in a wall, until it surrounds you completely. Military bases are supposed to feel secure. Fences, checkpoints, cameras, and armed men at every corner. On paper, Fort Hood was untouchable, but soldiers who lived there at night tell a different story. When darkness settled, the base changed. The harsh white floodlights left long shadows, carving black corridors between the buildings. The wind carried strange sounds across the empty motor pools, metal creaking doors slamming even when locked boots, echoing when no one was walking. Inside the barracks, the storm didn't sound like ordinary rain. It beat against the tin roofs with an almost deliberate rhythm, like knuckles rapping on a door. The lights flickered too often. Radios crackled with bursts of static, whispering half-words in voices no one could identify. The setting was perfect for doubt, and in the military, doubt is poison. One veteran later admitted, "It wasn't the war games that kept us awake. It was the nights in between, the sense that the base was never really empty, even when it should have been. It wasn't ghosts they feared, it was the unknown. Something that walked the perimeters but never left footprints. Something that whispered through the power lines, bending the shadows just enough to make them question reality." Imagine being 19, fresh out of high school, sent to a base hours away from home. You're trained to follow orders, to march, to shoot, to obey. But no one trains you for silence. No one prepares you for the long nights when the mind wanders and the heart refuses to slow down. For these young men, fear wasn't an enemy they could fire at. It was something that lived inside them, something they tried to laugh away with bad jokes, cigarettes, and quiet conversations about girls back home. Yet even in their laughter, cracks showed. Some confessed they were having strange dreams, dreams of walking down endless hallways where faceless men watched from the corners. Others woke drenched in sweat, certain someone had been standing at the foot of their bed. A sergeant once wrote in his journal, "They tell me the kids are just homesick. But homesickness doesn't explain why they wake screaming at 3 a.m. It doesn't explain the bruises they find on their arms when no one touched them. Something else is happening here." For the soldiers, the worst part wasn't seeing things. It was the way fear lingered. It made them second-guess their senses. Was that shadow outside the window a tree branch, or was it moving against the wind? Was the sound on the roof rain or footsteps? And when you're 19, the line between imagination and reality is thin. But at Fort Hood, that line seemed to vanish altogether. The storm wasn't the first warning. The men had already noticed strange things before that night at the fence. One soldier swore he saw a figure standing by the old mess hall long after curfew, staring up at the floodlights. When he approached, the figure vanished. Another claimed he heard knocking on his door at 2 a.m. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. But it was the electrical failures that truly unnerved them. Power would cut without warning. Generators that had just been inspected would sputter and die. Radios would hum with voices, familiar voices like fellow soldiers calling their names. Yet when they responded, no one was on the other end. The strangest incident happened in the armory. 2 privates reported that their rifles had been moved during the night, rearranged into a pattern on the floor. They thought it was a prank, until they realized the barrels were pointing in a perfect circle, all inward, as though aimed at an invisible center. No one took responsibility. No one confessed. And when the commanding officer asked, the soldiers simply stayed silent. Because how do you explain the unexplainable? It escalated one night when a patrol dog refused to move past the northern gate. Its handler tugged at the leash, but the animal whined, bristled, and dug its paws into the ground. Finally, it turned and ran tail between its legs, dragging the handler behind. Soldiers laughed it off, but unease spread like wildfire. If even the animals were afraid, what did that mean? And then came the whispers. Not loud enough to catch every word, but unmistakable. Conversations in empty rooms, breathing in hallways no one was walking through. One private swore he heard his mother's voice calling him from the shadows outside the barracks. Another claimed he heard a dead friend's laughter in the static of the radio. The men stopped trusting their senses. They stopped trusting themselves. Fear became the unspoken enemy, crouching in every corner, waiting in every flicker of the light. By the time the storm came, by the time the crawling figure appeared at the fence, the soldiers were already primed for terror. The groundwork had been laid. Their nerves were frayed, their judgment clouded. The encounter that night wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. A climax to weeks, maybe months of tension building in silence. And that's what makes this story so chilling. Because it wasn't just one night of fear, it was a pattern, a haunting, a slow descent into darkness that no one dared to record in the logbooks. And yet, when the night came, when the storm raged and the figures appeared, the soldiers weren't surprised. They were terrified, yes, but deep down some part of them had been waiting for it. Because you can only ignore the darkness for so long before it steps into the light. The storm had battered Fort Hood for hours, but what unsettled the men most wasn't the thunder or the wind. It was the silence between the gusts, those moments when the world seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to arrive. By now, the soldiers had already endured weeks of strange disturbances, whispers in the dark radios humming with phantom voices, dogs refusing to patrol certain fences. Fear was no longer a fleeting reaction. It had settled in like a permanent resident. And that night, during the storm, fear would finally step out of the shadows. The lightning struck, turning night into day for a split second. And in that burst of light, Private Griffin saw it. A shape crouched low against the fence. At first he thought it was a man, maybe another soldier caught outside during the storm. But then the shape moved too fast, too twisted. Its limbs bent wrong, dragging along the mud like something crawling out of a nightmare. Griffin's breath caught. He whispered to his partner Statera, "Do you see that?" Another flash of lightning, and now the shape was clinging to the fence head, cocked unnaturally backward as if staring at them, with a face they couldn't quite see. The storm roared, but in that instant, Griffin swore he heard a faint scratching metal on metal nails dragging across wire. The men froze. Their training screamed for them to shout a command, raise their rifles, call it in. But something primal told them not to move, not to speak. It wasn't fear of disobedience. It was the sense that whatever stood before them didn't belong to their world. And then, as if aware of their terror, the figure slid down the fence and melted into the shadows. The soldiers tried to shake it off. Maybe they had imagined it. Maybe the storm had played tricks on their eyes. But when they looked beyond the fence, their blood turned cold. More shapes, dozens of them. Standing just far enough away to blur into the darkness, yet close enough that their silhouettes were unmistakable. Human-like, but wrong, too tall, too thin. Their heads tilting in eerie unison. They didn't advance. They didn't retreat. They simply gathered, watching. The floodlights flickered, casting brief beams across the field. Each time the light steadied, the figures seemed closer, though no one had seen them move. Griffin gripped his rifle so tight, his knuckles whitened. Statera muttered a prayer under his breath. Both men knew the rules of engagement, but how do you engage shadows that refuse to stay still? One of the figures broke away from the group. It crawled just like the first one, arms bent, head swiveling toward them with unnatural speed. And then it stopped mere feet from the fence and rose upright taller than any man they'd ever seen. That was when the floodlights died. Darkness swallowed the base. The storm howled, but inside the blackout, there was only the sound of breathing theirs and something else's. Radios crackled alive, hissing with static. Through the noise came voices, familiar ones. Griffin heard his father's voice calling his name, though his father was hundreds of miles away. Statera heard his sister's laughter, the same laugh she'd made when they were children playing hide and seek. It wasn't possible. And yet it was happening. The men pressed their backs against the barracks wall, rifles raised, waiting for the figures to break through. But they didn't attack. Instead, the shadows circled their shapes, flickering in and out with every strike of lightning. Each flash revealed them closer, tighter, forming a ring. Griffin shouted into the radio for backup, but the only reply was his own voice echoing back, distorted, as if mocking him. Panic cracked discipline. Statera wanted to fire, to release the pressure building in his chest. Griffin held him back, whispering, "If we shoot, we're done." But deep down, both men knew it didn't matter. They weren't fighting enemies that bled. They were facing something else, something that fed on fear, on belief, on the very act of acknowledging it. And just when the pressure reached its peak, the storm stopped. No wind, no rain, just silence. The floodlights roared back on, flooding the field in sterile white. And just like that, the figures were gone. No footprints, no mud disturbed near the fence, nothing but empty grass swaying in the night breeze. For a long time, neither man moved. They stood frozen, rifles still raised, waiting for something, anything to prove they hadn't lost their minds. But the base was quiet. Too quiet. Later, when they filed their report, the commanding officer dismissed it. Storm, stress, hallucinations. "You've been running on little sleep," he said. No one wrote about the shadows, the whispers, the voices calling their names. and yet the men who were there never forgot. Griffin admitted years later, "It wasn't what I saw that broke me. It was what I felt, like something was testing us, measuring us, deciding if we were worth whatever it was planning." Statera left the service not long after. He told his family the base had changed him. He never explained how. But among soldiers, the story spread quietly, retold in hushed tones over campfires and late-night watches. They called it the scratching. And each retelling carried the same chilling truth, no matter how secure the base, no matter how strong the floodlights there are. Places where the unknown waits just beyond the fence. Places where the enemy isn't human and the rules of war mean nothing. Chapter 2 had shown us the slow buildup, the atmosphere, the fear, the subtle signs that something unnatural lurked within Fort Hood. But Chapter 3 was the breaking point, the night the shadows revealed themselves, the night the soldiers came face to face with something they could never explain. And yet this is not the end. Because what happened at Fort Hood in 1992 was not an isolated event. Across oceans in the dense jungles of the Philippines during World War II, soldiers encountered something eerily similar. Shadows, whispers, figures that defied human explanation. Which begs the question, are these merely isolated stories born of fear and fatigue? Or are they fragments of a larger pattern, a secret war fought not against men, but against something far older, far darker, that follows armies wherever they go? The storm at Fort Hood eventually passed, but its echoes did not. For the men who stood guard that night, the encounter was a scar etched deeper than shrapnel. You can patch a wound clean, the blood bury the evidence. But how do you explain the things that vanish when the lights return? The truth was simple. You don't. You bury them in silence, you pass them down as whispers, and you pray the next man on duty never has to face the same shadows. Yet history shows us again and again that those shadows are patient. They follow wars, cling to soldiers, and reappear when the world is at its darkest. Fort Hood was not the beginning, nor was it the end. In every major conflict, strange reports hide between the lines of official history. During World War II, U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal swore they saw pale figures darting between trees faster than any human could move. In Vietnam, patrols described voices luring them deeper into the jungle, mimicking friends and family who were thousands of miles away. Commanders dismissed these accounts as fatigue jungle fever or the madness of prolonged combat. But the consistency is what chills. Different continents, different decades, different wars. And yet the same details repeat distorted human shapes, mocking voices the unshakable sense of being watched. At Fort Hood in 1992, Griffin and Statera thought they were alone in their terror. But the truth is they were part of a legacy older than the bases they served on. A legacy that stretches back across oceans and centuries. Because soldiers fight enemies of flesh and blood, but some say they also fight the ones that history refuses to put in books. To understand that legacy, you must travel back half a century to the Philippines in 1943. The world was burning with war, and deep in the jungle, American soldiers reported encounters with something far older than gunfire. They called it the aswang. In Filipino folklore, it is a shapeshifter part human, part beast, able to lure its prey with mimicry before tearing it apart. To skeptics, these were just stories told by locals, campfire tales to scare outsiders. But to the men stationed there, they were warnings. Soldiers described shadows that moved independently of their owners, trees that bent as if something massive passed by, though nothing was visible, and nights where the forest fell so silent you could hear your heartbeat pounding in your skull. Then came the scratches low against the wooden huts, clawing sounds that no animal native to the jungle could make. And just as at Fort Hood, the attacks were never straightforward. The aswang did not rush the gates. It circled, it tested, it whispered, always probing for fear, always waiting. Some soldiers returned home with medals, others returned with stories no one believed. But when they heard Griffin and Statera's testimony decades later, they felt a familiar chill. Different time, different soil, but the same presence. Here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because once you align the accounts, a disturbing pattern emerges. The phenomena appear where violence blooms. Battlefields, bases, war zones. From the trenches of Europe to the jungles of Asia, and even to the training grounds of Texas, soldiers whisper of figures that don't bleed, voices that don't belong, and shadows that wait just beyond the floodlights. What are they? Some believe they are spirits of the fallen souls twisted by violence, forever feeding on fresh war. Others argue they are something older, predators drawn to humanity's darkest hours, the way vultures circle death. Griffin once said, "It felt like we weren't the first ones they'd tested, and we won't be the last." His words echo countless testimonies buried in military archives, redacted in black ink stamped with the phrase, "psychological breakdown." But ask yourself, how many breakdowns describe the same tall silhouettes, the same backward-bending limbs, the same scratching on metal? Coincidence doesn't repeat itself across generations. So where does this leave us? Fort Hood is still active. Soldiers still train there, still patrol its fences. Few know the story of that storm in 1992. Fewer still would believe it, but if you listen closely in the barracks at night, you may catch the whispered warnings passed from one young recruit to another. Don't ignore the scratching. Don't look too long into the shadows. And whatever you do, never answer the voice if it calls your name. The legacy of fear isn't written in books or carved in stone. It lives in the pauses, between thunder in the silence, after gunfire, in the moments when every soldier feels eyes on him, though no one is there. Some say these encounters are nothing more than stress and imagination. Others believe they are proof of a hidden war one humanity has been losing since the first spear was raised in anger. But one thing is certain: when the floodlights fail, when radios hiss with voices that shouldn't exist, when shadows gather just beyond the fence, you understand that war is never fought only against men. And in that moment, you realize something even more terrifying. The enemy doesn't need to win. It only needs you to believe. From the storm at Fort Hood to the jungles of the Philippines, from the whispers of World War II to the lingering silences of today, the pattern is clear. These encounters refuse to fade. They return decade after decade, feeding on fear, hiding in the blind spots of history. So the next time you hear scratching at night or a voice calling you from the dark, ask yourself, are you truly alone? Or are you standing where countless soldiers once stood, at the edge of a battlefield, much larger, much older, and far more terrifying than any war humanity has ever fought? Because some enemies don't march, they wait. And when the lights go out, they come closer.